Hello everybody and welcome to this video in which I'm going to talk about Granblue Fantasy, a newish fighting game which I haven't had a chance to get into until this week. I've been playing it like crazy, getting ready for a review. That won't be available on digitally-downloaded.net until early next week, but I did want to do a video of my first impressions. But before I get into that, I did want to say I hope everybody out there is staying well and safe and self-isolating and doing the right thing to try and get on top of this COVID disease problem that the world is facing. I know it's boring to be stuck inside and not be able to go anywhere. Even if you usually do spend a lot of time indoors or work from home, you can feel very antsy in not being able to go out. That's certainly the situation I find myself in. But we should all accept that this is going to be the normal for most of the year, if not longer, and we should all make the most of it. We should all take this opportunity to read more books, watch more movies, catch up on some of the classics, and of course play more video games. And that's what this YouTube channel's here to do, and I'll certainly be covering as much as I can get my hands on over the next 6 months. So hopefully we can have some fun together, and we can get through this without anybody getting sick. That doesn't need to. So Granblue Fantasy. This is a tie-in game to a mobile RPG thing that was, or still is, huge in Japan, but hasn't really made its way out anywhere else as far as I'm aware. It's certainly not available in Australia, so if you were to play it, you'd have to VPN in and all that kind of stuff. So I haven't played the actual RPG, so I wasn't sure how I'd get along with the fighting game, given that it is a tie-in and does take certain assumptions that you know what some of the characters are and the general kind of environment and world that Granblue Fantasy provides. But I have found myself absolutely in love with this game. I'm a big fan of Arc System Works and its fighting games. BlazBlue, for example, big game for me. I really do love that. Guilty Gear, of course, the Persona fighting game that was tied in, well, the Persona 4 fighting game itself, but also the crossover one that they did with BlazBlue and other properties. All of the Arc System Works stuff kind of turns to gold as far as I'm concerned. The only one I wasn't a huge fan of was the Dragon Ball one, but that was more, I think, I'm not a big fan of Dragon Ball. So, in that context, the fact that this one may well become my favourite Arc System Works fighting game of all is it's pretty impressive. I wasn't expecting it going in, but I found myself really enjoying this game. The first thing which is immediately obvious is that it is gorgeous. Of course, Arc System Works really has a mastery over 2D fighting game engines and character models and animation and all that stuff. So I knew going in that it was going to be good, but I didn't expect it to be quite this good. Granblue Fantasy, one of the reasons that it is so popular is that it is really beautiful. It has amazing character design. The world is vivid and vibrant, and that's why people are willing to spend a lot of money on the gacha system to make sure they get their favorite characters. This game doesn't have that gacha system, thank goodness. You just get to enjoy the characters up front. There'll probably be DLC down the track, but the base game is complete, and you don't need to dip into microtransactions. You can just enjoy these amazing, vivid character designs. There's a lot of fan service, of course there is. The women characters are all very short-skirted and very well endowed, let's put it that way. And the attacks, the combat system is not quite as explosive as it is in BlazBlue, at least the standard that I'm playing it to at the moment. It's not quite. It's slightly more restrained, and it's slightly more methodical in pacing, so there's a little bit more, I guess, tactical nuance to it, I feel, than BlazBlue. BlazBlue is very much about fast reactions and really kind of almost twitch responses to enemy attacks, and the level of kind of explosive energy that you could get out of your fighting style in BlazBlue was really impressive. And like I said, I do love BlazBlue, but this game is slightly different in tone. All of the characters feel very different to play, which is always a good sign. There aren't that many characters, and that's perhaps me coming off the high of the Dead or Alive series, which everybody that follows this channel knows I love. There's a lot of characters in Dead or Alive. This one, it doesn't have nearly that many. Of course, it was to be expected because this is a new fighting game. This is their first attempt at Granblue Fantasy, so they couldn't exactly go and throw 40 characters into the roster. But the roster that is there, the team has made sure that they all feel very different to play. So if you take the Archer character, it really does feel like this character is designed about ranged attack, and you really need to hold back and try to avoid melee as much as possible. My favourite character uses a kind of long polearm spear. She's got twin tails, that's why I picked her first up, but I actually found that I quite like her combat style as well. She's got good reach, but you know, if you can get within that reach, then she can find herself in a bit of trouble. So there's characters which have light fast attacks, big heavy characters. You're seeing a light versus heavy character here, and while pretty much every fighting game has that rock paper scissors system in place, so far this one feels like it's not so much that, it's more about you really need to understand your character. Your character doesn't have any particular strengths and weaknesses against the other ones. It really depends on just how well you've mastered that character to how much of an advantage you have over your opponent. But again, I'm very new to this game, so that might change as I play on a little bit more. You're seeing just my first 2 hours or so of play, if that, here, and I'm really struggling at the moment to get my head around some of the characters, and I'm just not particularly good at fighting games in the first place in terms of the mechanics. I enjoy them a great deal, but I'm not very good at them. So it takes me a while to learn them to a level where I feel like I'm comfortable with a character. But like I said, I'm really enjoying the process. I think each of the characters feels great, and yeah, it's off to a really good start with me. The other thing that I found really impressive with this game is it has an RPG mode which actually feels like some kind of cohesive RPG mode, which also brings in elements from the Granblue Fantasy mobile game, in that you collect equipment after matches, after levels, after stages, and then you use that equipment to level up other equipment, basically just like every RPG that you would have played on mobile games if you played many of them. This one has that kind of system in there, with the equipment also then improving your character statistics and stuff in the RPG mode. The RPG mode also has narrative sections which open and close major battles. It has a 3-star system in terms of determining how well you did in a particular battle, which is again very reminiscent of the mobile approach to RPGs. And it really does feel like what I would expect from Granblue Fantasy. Not that I've played it, but it excuse me, it feels just like what I would expect from a mobile RPG, just with an action kind of combat system. And with a lot of games, fighting games that try and do RPG modes or in-depth story modes, like BlazBlue for example, when it gets to fight time, you're still squaring off one against one of the major characters. And the narrative kind of wraps itself in loops, trying to come up with a reason that this character has to fight this character at this point in time in the narrative. With Granblue Fantasy, a lot of the stages actually involve enemies that you would expect to fight in an RPG, so kind of nameless peons or monsters like wolves or mimics or whatever else. And then you do a couple of those battles, and that would then lead up to a major conflict with one of the other major characters, which again feels very authentically RPG. So this is an RPG mode that actually feels like they've taken the fighting game engine and turned it into an RPG, and that's very appealing to me because I love my RPGs. I really do love JRPGs, and fighting games that can cross over with that genre is certainly a good thing. I don't know if the plot follows along with the mobile game Granblue Fantasy, because again, I haven't played the mobile game, but this story does feel very mobile-like. It's not a deep story, it's not this kind of intense philosophical musing like a Final Fantasy or Trials of Cold Steel or whatever other JRPG you can think of. It's not that. It's very light-hearted, very simple, and the story's quite, quite focused on driving characters into conflict with one another. But it's just the effort that's really impressing me at this stage, and I'm certainly intrigued and want to keep playing on. What's on the screen in front of you is an example of what I'm talking about. It's your characters fighting off against hordes of goons rather than a named enemy character. These kind of enemies pop up in a few different levels already in the early stages. Some have bows, some have swords, some have polearms or whatever, and you need to defeat a certain number of them or survive for a certain length of time. The variety in these missions is quite good, and all of that goes to really contributing to make Granblue Fantasy feel like it's a full-featured game, even though the roster is relatively thin by fighting game standards. The combat system itself is also quite simple to learn, and again feels like the developers have really thought about how to take the qualities of a JRPG and turn it into a fighting game system. So on the top left hand corner of the screen there, where you see my character's health and stuff, there are 4 little icons which represent skills, and you can activate those skills with a single button press, and then there's a cooldown period before you can use that skill again. Very much reminiscent of how mobile RPGs work. And then there's also a couple of additional kind of secondary skills that you can get and then equip to your character to customize them. And the actual combo system is relatively limited by comparison. There's some basic kind of, press the same button 3 times to do 3 different attacks, and you can flow attacks together to create longer sequences. But it's not like a traditional fighting game in where you have to memorize all kinds of thumb rolls around the controller pad, button combinations, and endlessly kind of cycle through all of that stuff, and there's like a move list which is 300 miles long and takes years to master. This game doesn't have that stuff, so I think it's actually quite accessible for fighting game people, or for people who are, I think it's quite accessible for people who are not familiar with fighting games. I think that this one is actually a really good intro to the genre for people who might be coming from the being a fan more of the art style and the RPG side of things. So to give you an idea of where the appeal of Granblue Fantasy comes in, a couple of years ago at Tokyo Game Show, the developer-publisher of this game, Cygames, took out the biggest booth on the floor by a long way. It was bigger than Sony's and Konami's and Koei Tecmo's and all the other traditionally big booths. But it wasn't there to try and get people to come in and play the game, because you could just download it onto your phone anyway. That wasn't the point of it. The point of it was to get people's attention and make them want to play the game in the first place. So to do that, the developers built this booth into this amazing replica of the airships that you actually see in the game. And when I walked into the when I walked into the hall, I had no idea what Granblue Fantasy was, but I saw that fantasy ship and I just had to go and check it out. That was the first thing I wanted to see when I was there. So that kind of tells you, I guess, where the effort of the developers has gone to. When you think about it, mobile games in Japan are an incredibly competitive space, and just catching eyeballs is so important to the success of the game. What they've done here, I think, is very similar to the success that Final Fantasy saw in the early days, where it had Yoshitaka Amano creating the most beautiful concept art. And that concept art, by the time the developers had worked out how to turn it into a gameplay feature, really lent an extra level of depth to the fantasy. And what separates, I guess, Final Fantasy from a lot of the other early era RPGs is it has that sense of context and imagination and creativity in it, and that comes from the art. And I think Granblue Fantasy is much the same. The actual mechanics, as far as I understand, are fairly simple and fairly standard kind of mobile stuff, but there's this sense that this art creates a more vivid world, and the characters have more personality and characterization, and you want to get to know them, you want to have your favorite characters much more. And I think that's why a fighting game kind of really suits Granblue Fantasy, especially in the West, where people tend to be more leery about mobile RPGs and the gacha mechanics. By having a fighting game, you get to give players the exact same experience as they get with the mobile RPG, in that it's all about the characters and the world building and that imagination, and finding ways to give players the ability to explore that imagination. But it does so in a way that's more palatable to the West. So I know that a fair few people were a little bit confused why Cygames would release this in English when the base game that it's the game that it's based on is not. And I think that's the real reason. It's just that this is the way that they can introduce players to Granblue Fantasy and the world, and they can continue to build it from there. Anyway, that's enough for this video. Look out for my review on digitallydownloaded.net on Monday or Tuesday, hopefully, at the latest. It's going to be a good one unless the game drops off a cliff. Please do like and subscribe if you enjoy my videos, and please do consider backing me on Patreon, because that always helps. Thank you, and we'll see you at the next video.